Welcome to another issue of Why Marx. Now, we're looking at Marx and Engels and nature, the environment. There is widespread agreement among climate scientists that human activity, unquote, has been responsible for global warming over the last century. It's also well documented that Exxon, for example, knew the part being played by petroleum production 40 years ago, but spent millions to promote misinformation and climate skepticism. At the same time, we're constantly told it's what we have to do to control what is now a worldwide extinction event. We have to reduce eating meat consumption, for example, or we have to start buying electric cars instead of petrol ones. And with no thought to the environmental impact of lithium mining, for example, for batteries. Yet none of this will make the slightest difference compared to the growing output of greenhouse gases from industry, particularly in the developed countries. It will be the poorest countries that will suffer the most. A caricature of Marx and Engels is they were in favour of kind of unbridled development in order to create the conditions of abundance for socialism. However, tonight, Rob Gould and Tina Werkmann are here to put the record straight and show how Marx and Engels were opposed to the destruction of the natural environment and nature of which humanity is, of course, a part. So without further ado, then, over to Rob.
Thank you, Ian. A good introduction. So I'll just share this. Okay. Right. So today we're looking at Marx and nature. The talk today is really going to focus on the interpretation present in Marx's Ecology, Materialism and Nature by John Bellamy Foster. Bellamy Foster presents the collated view, the collated work of Marx on ecology in an accessible format, while challenging traditional concepts about Marx's view in relation to the environment, nature and ecology. He does this by taking us through the works of Marx and his predecessors, and at each step highlights the importance that Marx places on balance with nature and ecology. This talk will use this interpretation to draw attention to some of Marx's ideas about nature and how this may shape a communist future, while providing us with alternative angles to critique modern issues around climate change, sustainability, and ecocide. So we're going to start by looking at the philosophical roots of Marx's materialism over the idealism prominent in the dialectic of Hegel, and how this in turn invokes a fundamental difference in the role of the external world on human life. Then we will look at the kind of concept of alienation of man from nature, an important aspect of Marx's arguments against the mode of production of capital, and an angle that critics of Marx often get needlessly hung up on. After this, we will address how this concept of alienation pertains to Marx's concept of metabolic rift, and how this in turn can be expanded into two sub-issues, the unhelpful separation of town and country, and the exhaustive agricultural practices of the 19th century. After each of these areas, there will be a short summation of how these arguments can be extended into a 21st century setting without much stretch from the conceptual work of Marx. So we're going to start off with a bit of philosophy. So Bellamy Foster begins by examining the kind of the history of Marx's political and philosophical thought. Now, I'll admit I'm not the most comfortable in talking in this area. Epistemological philosophy as a topic tends to leave me a little tied in knots. The lack of solidity in the realm of human interaction with the external world, or that there is indeed an external world, begins to leave me in a foggy trance from which I struggle to pull myself out of. So forgive me if I lack clarity or brevity in this section. Despite this, I think it's very important that we spend some time unpicking where Marx stood on this debate, as it sets a groundwork for the relationship with nature we can see is consistent throughout his work. In this debate, we can easily wind the clocks right back to ancient Greece. We could go to Epicurus and Plato and Aristotle, and carry on through to Bacon, Locke, Hume, and Kant. But such a discussion would use up all of my time, and I really want to get into the nuts and bolts of Marx and nature. So we'll start with a brief summation of Marx and the ancients. So Marx appears to be most influenced in terms of his materialism by the work of Epicurus. We could tell this from the position Marx takes in his doctoral thesis at the start of his academic career. And that is that Marx's materialism has a lot of influence from Epicurean materialism. That is that all things in the universe can be explained using material terms, and including human consciousness and the mind. Similarly, in Marxist materialism, history is explained by humans' interaction with the external world in the societal form, specifically the material conditions created by the modes of production present through history. This is significant as both are a move away from idealism and dialectic driven by, sorry, I skipped ahead there. And so idealism is the concept that the world is shaped exclusively by human or divine ideas. Hegel's absolute idealism and dialectic driven by the Geist were critiqued by Marx and other young Hegelians extensively. Though the dialectic was adapted by Marx to become part of his historical materialism. That is, that history is driven by the contradictions created by human societies in different times and places. I won't attempt to kind of over-explain or get into the nuances of the philosophical positions here, as I've already kind of said. So, why is the epistemology of Marx important to understanding his relationship with nature? Well, it comes down to the view of Marx and many other materialist philosophers that humans are from nature as opposed to beyond nature. The idealist view, of which many philosophers that Marx is responding to hold, is that humans are divided from nature and that their relationship is kind of deterministic. Interestingly, both mechanical materialists and idealists are deterministic in that mechanical materialists see humans as bound to their primal urges and are restricted to the expropriation of the natural world. Hegelian idealists kind of see are deterministic in that they see that it is their right to exploit the world due to the kind of divine precedence of the Geist spirit that moves through human history, and that humans are kind of are insignificant in controlling this spirit, and that it is, you know, the kind of divine hand of God. So this in terms that this in turn means that it is the human prerogative to dominate nature and bend it to its will, according to idealists and mechanical materialists. We can see this particularly in Malthus, whose idealist notions about the incompatibility of humans and nature lead to ideas about scarcity and overpopulation that Marx sought to undo. This undoing of this notion has led many critics of Marx to hold the view that he is in favor of a kind of Promethean or mechanical materialism. However, Marx's view is less prescriptive and avoids determinism. He did not diminish the role of human rationality in the relationship of man and nature, and this is vital for understanding his notions of class consciousness and praxis, the impact of ideas on society. Therein, because Marx rejects fixed deterministic materialism, he cannot be said to be wholly Promethean. Instead, a better way to express his view would be that the human relationship to nature can change and has changed over time. And there is not one way that this relationship is determined to proceed. Therefore, humans are not always destined to have an exploitative relationship with nature. And this is vital for understanding the concepts that follow. So next we go on to alienation from nature. There's a good quote we'll come on to in a minute. Humans are part of nature. So Bellamy Foster established Marx as a dialectical or historical materialist. So now we can get into the material evidence for the appropriation of humans from nature under the capitalist mode of production. For Marx in his early writings, humanity exists with nature as follows. The whole of nature is his, and that's humanity's, inorganic body. One as a direct means of life, and two as the matter, the object, and the tool of his activity. Nature is man's inorganic body, that is to say, nature insofar as it is not the human body. Man lives from nature, i.e. nature is his body, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. To say that man's physical and mental life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature. So we kind of get this idea from this kind of, from Marx's early writings here, that Marx sees humans and nature to be in symbiosis. The two must be in dialogue with each other in order to survive. However, under the capitalist mode of production, human labour is alienated from its natural state, that is, of transforming nature to meet their needs, and is instead reduced to a commodity. That it can be purchased and used to fulfil the commodity wants of a society. This can be placed to historical accumulation, which we've addressed in previous meetings. The transplanting of humans from the land through force, law, and ruination, and the move from peasantry to industrialized labor. At this point, the dominant force over nature becomes the feudal lordship, but over time transformed into bourgeois society through acquired land from the feudal lordships and enhanced this exploitation in the production of commodity. Marx considers this to be the rule of dead matter over both humans and nature. Dead matter because it is the historic capital of the bourgeoisie that enables the purchase and exploitation of nature and labor. Marx does not just see this in relation to rural agriculture, but also in the city, referring to the universal pollution to be found in large towns. In this instance, he is referring to the comparative squalor of the town-dwelling worker, as opposed to the natural order to be found in nature. And there's another quote: where light, air, and simple animal cleanliness ceases to be a need for the man. So he's talking about there the kind of the removal of the basic needs of man in an industrial setting in his own time. And we can see that in play currently in kind of the capitalist workplace as well. Maybe not to those extremes in this country, but certainly if you look worldwide, it's more apparent. Okay, so we can see from this this is a clear objection from Marx about the material conditions of humans under capital, that it is against our nature to exist in this condition, that we are separated from a natural state and are plunged into the unnatural production of commodity. Marx proposes the alternative, an association of producers that will restore man's intimate links with the land in a rational way, no longer mediated by serfdom, lordship, and an imbecile mystique of property. This is because the earth ceases to be an object of barter, and through free labor and enjoyment once again becomes an authentic personal property for man. So Marx here is calling for the restoration of a natural order as opposed to the oppressive conditions on both man and nature or property. Given the earlier quotes, which shows the view that a dialogue between nature and man is essential for survivability of the species, we can therein envisage a society where there is a more equitable relationship with nature, not one of exploitation. This is important, as often Marx has been referred to as a Promethean or an admirer of capital's productive process, whereas he can clearly be seen to be opposed to the alienation created by the mode of production and sought to remove and reimagine this relationship. From this perspective stems the remaining critique of capital's relationship with nature. So next we're going to come on to the concept of metabolic rift. I've got this diagram here which kind of shows human metabolism, which is to grow, eat, excrete, compost, and grow. So it's a cycle. This is simplified form, but basically that diagram I feel kind of sums it up a little. So they're referenced earlier in the first quote. This section will attempt to lay out the concept of metabolic rift. This is a real scientific thrust in Marx, and Bellamy Foster highlights the centrality of the concept in Capital and the work of Marx in the critique of the separation of town and country and in the degradation of soil quality. So we'll come on to that later. All these ideas are kind of interconnected. And the degradation of soil quality seen in the 19th century, resulting in food shortages and famines. For Marx, human metabolism was the means of consumption of material matter from nature. As underpinned by the first quote in this talk, it is the relationship between man and nature that ensures its survival. This metabolism is met through human labor, which transforms nature to meet the needs to meet its needs through agriculture. The rift is created by the interruption of this relationship, and that in turn leads to starvation, homelessness, and sickness for the working class. The rift is created by the demands of capitalistic production and stands opposed to human freedom and wider equality of human needs. Bellamy Foster pads out the idea, linking two key concepts from nature of how this metabolism is interrupted, as aforementioned. the separation of town and country, and the degradation of the soil. So it's an interruption of the human metabolism is the rift, and human labor transforms nature. It's kind of key ideas there. So going on to the separation of town and country, for Marx, it's one of the biggest factors in the disruption of the human metabolism. He spoke many times on the irrationality of it and the societal ills that are created by it. The critique stretches back to ancient civilizations. The Greeks also had a kind of separation of town and country, and many other cultures did as well. For Marx and Engels, it is the division of labor that creates barriers to unity of labor and differentiates the conditions of the laborer. So here's a quote: "The distinction can only exist within the framework of private property. It is the most crass expression of the subjection of the individual under the division of labor, under a definite activity forced upon him, a subjection which makes a man into a restricted town animal and another into a restricted country animal, and daily creates a new conflicts between their interests." Marx and Engels argued that this resulted in the removal of the rural population from all world intercourse and consequently from all world culture. So it's a kind of sidelining of the rural, the capacity of the rural working class to participate in activities in relation to politics or in relation to other things involved in the the politics of the city. So, of course, under capitalism, historically, there's a large period of forcibly removing people from the country to the city. Marx references himself the Highland clearances as an example of this. He critiques Proudhon for kind of failing to recognize the importance of the separation of town and country as a significant historical development in capitalism. In Manifesto, Marx draws attention to how the segregation of town and country has been expanded to the world stage. Capital has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and thus has rescued a considerable part of the population from idiocy. Now, by idiocy here, he doesn't mean idiocy as we might think of idiots or idiocy. He means idiotes, which is kind of from the Greek, which is a rural dwelling person. Just as the country is dependent on the town, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries depend on civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeoisie, on nations of bourgeois, the east to the west. So in Manifesto, he's talking about how the separation of town and city is spread internationally. It's not just within one country, it's part of the greater market. So we know ourselves that the above relationship is entirely essential to the production of 21st century capital. We rely on cheap imports from the global south. We rely on agriculture in different communities in the global south for our own commodity production today. And yet, from a pragmatic point of view, it is entirely rational that we transport half our goods from halfway around the world. And sketchy language aside, it paints a vivid picture of the international division of labor characteristic of the separation of town and country. For Marx, this represents not only that, but the division of mental and material labor, characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. So to counteract this division and the squalid conditions in cities, Marx and Engels proposed the dissolution of the distinction between town and country and called for a combination of agricultural and manufacturing industries. So they're looking at creating kind of, smaller population hubs across the country, and for the whole population to be more adequately dispersed across the country. So again, particularly in Britain, we have a huge amount of our land that's given over to a very few landowners. And under communism, that would take a different form. There would be more room for people to live, and a better use of it. So the solution directly impacts on the metabolic rift highlighted earlier, as humans with access to both agriculture and industry will be more able to meet their material needs immediately. So how can this be more related to the modern world? Well, one of the biggest sources of carbon emission is international trade of goods world over. Due to the advances in transportation and technology, the industrial workforce is no longer explicitly bound to the industrial centres. We can see a global trend stretching back to the 20th century of workers being removed from cities to reside in suburbs or satellite towns and be more reliant on commuting. However, for production, there is still a huge population that resides in cities, especially in the kind of BRIC countries. The mind boggles at the contribution of global emissions of commuters. If you can imagine, how many cars and vehicles are used to transport workers from one place to another, when it's not really necessary. You can see how that impacts on our own climate crisis. Furthermore, it would allow greater numbers of the population to enjoy green spaces and localized production for need. This presents very real solutions to the climate emergency and to increasing sustainability in our own world. So again, that's the 21st century link, that the idea of localized production still has a lot of weight today. So next we go on to looking at soil degradation of the 19th century. And I've got a diagram here of the kind of broken of the metabolic rift. So this is how, particularly in agriculture, the metabolic rift has been broken. We start off with a process of chemical fertilizer that grows, we eat, we discard, and it creates waste and pollution. All right. So again, this can be a circle, but under capitalism, it is broken, and we have a waste pollution as a kind of byproduct of that. So expanding on scientific discoveries made by chemists in the 19th century, notably Liebig, who addressed the importance of soil nutrients to the fertility of crop production, Bellamy Foster has extensively researched and produced the following conclusions. During the 19th century, the apparent decline of productive soil was a major concern for capitalist nations. Events like the potato famine of 1845 to 52 in Ireland had instilled a major fear in capitalist nations on the whole about the longevity and durability of crop production. Especially considering they were undergoing a period of massive industrial expansion in which they would need a greater supply of food readily available. So in response to this fear, there was a worldwide scramble in pursuit of bone and guano, which is deposits of bird feces found in tropical environments usually, for the purposes of fertilization. Liebig highlights that this job could also be achieved by manure and human waste. When writing Capital, Marx became convinced that these solutions could not be adequately met by capitalism in his day, and that the division of labor inherent in the system, the antagonism between the town and the country, got in the way. There was a massive attempt by capitalism of its time to pursue international sources of fertilizer, rather than looking at its own agricultural and city-dwelling populations for the solution. Marx argued that the sewage of the cities was a massive waste of resources, and that human waste could go a long way to resolving fertilization issues. Of course, after the 19th century, we had the third agricultural revolution, which kind of did away with this, with the same issues that Marx was facing in terms of soil degradation. It saw a more steady increase in the production of chemical fertilizer, automated farming equipment, genetic modification of crops, better use of pesticides, etc., etc. And it saw a lot of these issues resolved that Marx was highlighting. However, the solution that Marx points to really shows his forward thinking in relation to sustainability and a degree of joined up thinking about ecology. If Marx had been aware of the consequences of burning fossil fuels on global temperatures, or the deforestation in the Amazon, and the possible solutions we have to the limitation and restriction of using said fuels and agricultural practices, I'm sure his thinking on the matter would be unchanged, that capitalism isn't equipped to deal with crises of this nature. In Iceland, in the present day, there is a single 5,000 meters squared greenhouse at Fríðheimar, which produces 90% of the tomatoes for the whole of Iceland. It does this, with access to such technology, the world production of agriculture could be turned on its head. The greenhouse in question also boasts a completely negative carbon footprint and uses bees to pollinate plants within it. So it promotes a kind of green relationship with production of crops. It's currently operating on a capitalistic economic model, but we can see how such green production is possible, but held back by the interests of global agriculture at the expense of our planet. That capitalism in its current form is unequipped to deal with the crisis at hand. Furthermore, our extended supply chain and reliance on international import and export only exasperates the problems we are faced with in relation to carbon emissions and global warming. Just as capitalism in the 19th century did with soil exhaustion and soil degradation. So we see, capitalism creates a problem in the 19th century with the environment, It came up with a scientific solution, but it took far longer to implement it than it should. And do we have that time with our current crisis? It's debatable. So again, Marx and Engels' kind of solution of localized associated producers, use of technology, and production of need over one kind of points to real solution to our own climate issues. So I'll come to the end of my talk now. So Bellamy Foster shows conclusively that the ideas of Marx and Engels on ecology remain relevant today, and answer those that would brand him as a machine-minded, anthropocentric materialist, as opposed to the historical materialist that he seems to present as. Above all, the relation of production is historically dependent, meaning there is a plurality in the solutions to crisis that communism can take. The communism described by Marx and Engels will need to be updated for modern issues in mind if we are going to present it as a global alternative to the capitalist mode of production. Like Marx, we need to embrace progressions in science and hold socially positive outputs, and to be ever thinking flexibly about how we can use discoveries made in the present to further the future of humanity. There is much more we could have gone into here. Marx relies on the work of Darwin to a great extent. Evolution is kind of key idea that he's taking into his political writings, and natural selection. But we could have gone on to a greater exploration of the condition of the working class in the 19th century, or we could critique the modern bourgeois green movement in Marx's terms. But again, we're limited for time, and I think we need to really just think about the alternatives that Marx and Engels can present to us for society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Excellent. What a great start. So I think without further ado, we'll go straight over to Tina, if Tina's happy with that. And then we'll have some questions addressed to both speakers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rob. I've got a little slideshow as well. Bear with me. Whoops, there it is. Okay, yes. Engels, just like Marx, was hugely important in terms of developing the idea that there is even something called ecology, and there is an ecological system, and that everything depends on everything else. Comrades must remember, I mean, this was a period when science was taking off, yes, but lots of it was still at the beginnings. Darwin had just published his book and was influenced by Marx and Engels, as well as the other way around. And Engels in particular, he took the ideas that were developed by himself and Marx and Darwin, took them a bit further, and he has also the advantage of writing a bit easier than Marx. So it's actually quite nice reading Engels on this. Like Marx, he was particularly accused of having a Promethean, a positivist attitude, which sort of means, oh, technology will solve it all. Technology is the be all and end all. And as socialists, they were charged and continue to be charged with the charge that they were into technology over everything. To support socialism, you don't really have to look after nature, etc. Engels went a bit further than Marx in terms of developing the idea that there is a dialectical material relationship between humans and nature, and he connected the social degradation of the working class with the degradation of nature. And he did this in a book called Dialectics of Nature in particular, which is not finished, but he's written one chapter, which is a very interesting one. I do urge comrades to read it, which is the part played by labor in the transformation of ape to man, where he looks particularly at the hand and discusses that the hand is both a tool of labor and it's the product of labor. So he describes, so he's of course aware of what Darwin has written and about, how genetic mutations and how evolution works. Engels explains in this chapter how the hand developed through natural selection because it was useful to people, to early humans, to in the evolution from ape to man. It was used over and over and developed. Then this tool, the hand, in turn changes nature, i.e. by making tools, by intervening into how we live, etc. We change nature, and this again in turn changes human beings. So humans used their hands before they had culture, before they had language, but by using the hand and creating tools and engaging with each other more, and coming down the trees, etc., we developed socially. We expanded our knowledge. We had to develop language, which she describes. So we, the hand, as I said, it changes nature, and it is changed by nature. So it's a nice example of the dialectical nature. He also describes that animals, of course, use tools as well, and they change nature as well in that sense by their mere presence. But man, or humans, says this old-fashioned language, man masters nature, and that is the difference. Which often that has been misunderstood as, oh, that means enslaving nature. You're mastering like a master and a slave, etc. But they meant it quite differently, and that's worth a separate slide. They meant it in the sense of mastering a language, mastering the laws of nature, not brutal exploitation. And Engels was quite clear about that, and in this chapter, let us not, however, flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human conquest over nature. For each such conquest takes its revenge on us. Each of them, it is true, has in the first place the consequences on which we counted, but in the second and third place, it has quite different, unforeseen effects, which only too often cancel out the first, i.e. it's a dialectical relationship. You do something to nature, nature does something back to you. This idea that this is an ecological system. As an example, he gives a number of examples. One is the Spanish planters in Cuba. What do they care? Who burned down the forest? The Spanish planters in Cuba burned down the forest on the slopes of the mountains and obtained from the ashes sufficient fertilizer for one generation of very highly profitable coffee trees. What cared they that the heavy tropical rainfall afterwards washed away the unprotected upper stratum of the soil, leaving behind only bare rock? So he describes what happens when you do something to nature. So he also outlines that, of course, it is not just all humans that have this kind of negative impact on nature, but in particular, it is the capitalists who are interested in exploiting the soil, interested in exploiting the earth. He describes in relation to nature as to society, the present mode of production is predominantly concerned only about the first tangible success. And then its surprise is expressed that the more remote effects of actions directed to this end turn out to be of quite a different, mainly even of quite an opposite character. He describes that at every step we are reminded that but we by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over foreign people, like someone standing outside of nature, but that we with flesh, blood and brain belong to nature and exist in its midst, and that all our mastery of it consists in the fact that we have the advantage over all other beings of being able to know and to correctly apply its laws, unlike animals who they live in nature, they affect it, of course, but they can't understand the laws of nature. They can't apply them and direct them, and obviously humans don't always apply them positively, as Engels points out, quite sophisticated. So yes, Engels is very keen to stress that science is not enough. Science will not, the application of science it will not end the dialectical contradiction between humanity and nature, which they both point out exists. As Rob discussed, the differentiation between town and country, the division there, which is inhuman, and it doesn't make much sense as well, logically, etc. So in order to reinstate that level of harmony, as they call it, an ecological balance, you need the abolition of the capitalist mode of production. I'm saying that, comrades know that obviously, but in the second part of my presentation, I wanted to put this in contrast to what a lot of green activists today do. And I think that is quite different to how Marx and Engels envisaged this. We normally don't deal with this in our sessions, but I think it's really important because it is such a huge subject and there is such a huge controversy. What can we do to stop the climate catastrophe? And, you know, we see in the news every day, just stop oil at the moment is, you know, everyday active, disturbing somewhere, something, or blocking a road, etc. How would Marx and Engels have engaged with them? I think they would have welcomed their, you know, their, let's put it, their energy, their attempt to do something, and, you know, rather than just appeal to politicians, which clearly doesn't work. But, you know, there are quite a few huge differences that follow up, and I think it's worthwhile discussing. The biggest one, I think, is this idea, and unfortunately, this is not an idea that's just limited to green activists, but it also finds reflection a lot on the left. And I've had arguments with people I consider quite close comrades who believe that there's simply too many people living on the planet, and this is the key problem, and this needs to be solved for the climate catastrophe. Obviously, the logic is too many people take up, you know, you need to produce too much, they consume too much, etc., etc. This is obviously not a new idea. Malthus in 1798 published this, a theoretical basis for this idea in his, anonymously actually, he published that essay on the principles of population. He argued that famine, disease, those kind of things that wipe out vast numbers of people was just nature's way of regulating itself, of dealing with overpopulation. So governments, ipso versa, should not intervene to stop any of those famines, etc. That's just what nature does. And governments are very keen to follow that piece of advice. The famine in Ireland, Bangladesh, millions and millions, lots more famines, of course, often where, you know, the British Empire ruled. They were just left to play out. They were exporting still, as comrades know, raw products, food from those places, while millions of people starved to death. And the ideological idea behind it came from Malthus. And governments, as I say, they did embrace that. It's always, of course, in the poorer countries. They wouldn't let that happen in Britain, I would have thought, unless you could draw a dividing line, could have drawn a dividing line between poor people and not so poor people. Later then in the 1970s, after the boom of World War II to an end, another attempt was made to theorize this idea of Malthus, which was the Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, 1968, that gave renewed impetus to the same ideology, more or less, of watching famine gripping Africa, parts of Asia. This time it was, and people tend to forget this, quite horrifically supplemented by campaigns of sterilization, mass sterilization in poorer countries, supported by the UN and the World Bank. You know, international capitalism kept friendly kleptocrats and oligarchs in place. Injustice, the inequality that led to these famines and this lack of food being distributed, etc. They left that all in place while continuing to exploit the whole continent for the needs of international capitalism. Marx had very little positive things to say about Malthus, and quite the opposite. Actually, he had a good old go at Malthus even then when he was still alive. I've put some quotes there on the screen. You know, his theory was a lampoon on the human race. His theories were greeted with jubilance by the English oligarchy as the great destroyer of all hankering after human development. And in Capital Volume 4, he devotes a whole chapter on demolishing Malthus and calls it an apologia for the poverty of the working classes. and quite right too. So from a human perspective, terrible, obviously a huge inhuman ideology. But also Marx pointed out, quite importantly, that Malthus clearly did not take, and I think this applies to some comrades today as well, they do not take into consideration that things change. Always things change. Each society possesses its own population laws. When that changes, then the society changes and the population law changes. Ancient Athens, for example, had an overpopulation problem hundreds of years ago, couldn't feed all its citizens, took drastic measures, planting numerous colonies of food, etc., all around it and further away up to Italy to try and feed its citizens. They expelled thousands of citizens because they couldn't feed them. And then if you look at the numbers, Athens then had around 300,000 inhabitants. Today in the same area, you got almost 4 million inhabitants. And of course, they can be fed. It's just it's a different technology, etc., and things change. Needless to say, this kind of theory attitude also leads to policies against migration and refugees. Allegedly, we're full up. I've been told Britain is full up, Germany is full up. Are we really? I mean, you just need to look at the birth rate. You need, for a society to reproduce itself, you need per woman, you need a birth rate of 2.1 children. And look around, there are very few people who have that many children. The birth rate in Germany is 1.52. So very similar in the UK, etc. So there's a negative birth rate because, of course, industrialization has changed all of that. It has changed population growth, etc. Peasant families, the attitude there is, of course, the more children, the better. That's free labor, so you need as many boys, to be honest, as possible to exploit. In proletarian families, entirely different. Children cost money. They're not there to help you, look after the shop, etc., help you with the farm, etc. They just cost money, which leads to obviously a negative birth rate in many Western countries. And this will expand, this negative birth rate. The more proletarianization goes on around the world, the more people are lifted out of poverty, the fewer children they will get. So population levels will not go up and up and up and up, as if you could draw a graph and it's always same, it will go up, there's horrific numbers, in 20 years, you'll have 100 billion on the planet, etc. Rubbish, very, very unlikely. Serious experts actually estimate that it won't get more than 10 billion, probably in the next 10 years or something. And then things will probably stabilize. I mean, you can't foresee the future, but it makes a lot of sense that, the more money people have, the more they come out of peasant establishments, they will get a lower birth rate. The key issue here is, of course, for many, many Greens, and that includes the Green Party, which until recently had a program of halving population in Britain through voluntary, who knows what exactly their ideas were. No migration for sure, no refugee. Soften that a little bit, but it's still the idea. It's people aren't the problem. It's too much consumption, etc. It doesn't matter how things are produced, etc. It's the sheer number of people. So they are the problem, as Ian mentioned at the beginning. For Marxists, of course, people are the solution, in particular, the working class. It all depends how things are done and who's running things and how things are run and how things are produced, etc. I'll get to that. There's another idea is that technology will solve it. And this is where actually a lot of the green people, green campaigners and capitalists combine their forces, where they meet in a sort of happy coincidental marriage to greenwash capitalism, if you wish, fiddling around the edges. I've put a few things there on screen. I don't have to teach comrades that, recycling, carbon trading, carbon capture, etc., amount to very little but trying to greenwash how things work. Clearly it's not the recycling that we should concentrate. It's just changing the way things are produced, so you don't have all that crap in your house. It shouldn't be any plastic bottles, shouldn't be even allowed to be produced anymore. Say what you want about East Germany, but they had a very interesting recycle scheme. You had one bottle for milk, there was one glass bottle for milk. So there were, that had to be washed and it was reused. It was recycled in that kind of way. You reuse it. A small glass for yogurt, etc. Constantly reused. That makes a lot more sense than having to crush up the glasses or the plastic bottles and make new ones out of it. So this is, there's the greenwashing going on. There's, of course, you electric cars. You mentioned that at the beginning. That's probably one of the biggest cons that the green movement has brought and has enforced on us. Electric vehicles, not only are they hugely damaging to produce for the environment, to run as well, and now electricity prices are through the roof anyway. The electricity has to come from somewhere. There's not enough sustainable energy being produced at the moment. The dismantling of the batteries, the production of the batteries, etc. There's also child labor involved, etc. So even in the UK, it takes currently about 4 years before an electric car produces less greenhouse gases than a petrol car. After that, they leave the entire car industry intact. This is wonderful for the car industry, Ford, etc., Mercedes. They love it. They can continue with the individual car production. It goes straight into their profit. Street building, everything stays as it is. We're just investing a bit more into this, into the electric cars. They don't do anything to stop the greenhouse gases, etc. It's a minor difference. It's hardly worth bothering. It is a total con. The Soviet Union, of course, is a huge problem as well for Marxists. The Soviet Union, the way it organized production was entirely ecologically horrendous. That despite the fact that with Bukharin and others, there were huge steps forward being made in ecological thinking at the beginning of the Soviet Union, after the Russian Revolution, really. There were huge strides forward, like with art and everything. Everything was exploding. Creativity was exploding. Ideas were flowing, and they had some fantastic thinkers and ideas there. But of course, that changed very, very quickly, unfortunately, with Stalin taking over, first 5-year plan, etc., etc. It's just one example I read in a book the other day, and it is so stupid. It really needs pointing out. Khrushchev in 1986. So this is after Hiroshima, etc. He wanted to irrigate the South to increase cotton production, and he wanted to divert 12 useless rivers, as they were called then, useless rivers that were flowing into the Arctic Ocean. Instead of wasting time digging new water channels, etc., they thought, we're just going to use small nuclear bombs. So they had a plan for 250 nuclear bombs to redirect rivers, etc. Obviously, this is one of those things where the unforeseen consequences then pretty quickly dawned on them. It didn't work. You can't bomb your way into new rivers, and obviously the fallout from nuclear bombing wasn't so good on the local populations, etc. So clearly, this is not something that works particularly well. So Marx and Engels, of course, welcomed technological advances. So they were very critical of the Luddites, for example, who wanted to destroy machinery and try and sabotage machinery. Socialism requires a level of abundance and productivity to allow humanity to live and not just to work, to survive. We need to have the development of the productive forces, but clearly not in the sense of production for production's sake, as in capitalism or, of course, the USSR. I wanted to quickly just touch on this red point, because it is true that capitalism, logically, if capitalism, pure capitalism, is incapable of solving the climate catastrophe. It is based on the need to make a profit. It is based on the need to expand. It needs to find new markets constantly. It needs to invent products that nobody needs and then create the need so that everybody thinks they need it, etc. So it's based logically on expansion and the opposite of saving the planet. However, we should take that quite seriously, because this touches on what Greens are saying as well, is there is the possibility that some of these people recognize, well, we live on that planet as well. Elon Musk is unlikely to be shot to Mars or the moon to survive, you know, the impending climate catastrophe. So there will possibly be a recognition at some stage that, yes, they will die as well. The rich people, they will not survive the climate catastrophe as well. So something might have to be done. Now, this will be, if it should come to that, and we should look at things like COVID, the reaction to COVID, or even the reaction to World War I and II, when capitalism suspended the law of value. Suddenly the magic money trees can be found to build weapons, to develop a vaccine, to put billions into, more or less useless PPE and stuff. The magic money tree is there if it's needed, and suddenly the law of value is suspended for emergency situations, even by capitalism, by those running capitalism. So it's not a huge chance, but it is possible that, something like this could happen with the climate catastrophe, and understanding that you need, this would be efforts from above, clearly, entirely anti-democratic, based on, radically changing production to save the planet, which would, of course, also go hand in hand with a reduction in the population from above, a not very pleasant one, I would have thought. And things like where you can't, workers shouldn't be able to strike against things like that, or even organize. So this is like an idea, that could be a fascistic solution to the climate catastrophe, is a possibility. It's also quite possible that this would be supported by some of the organizations who are now, campaigning against the climate catastrophe as saving the world, not saving, obviously, democracy or whatever, but just saving the world. So there is a tension coming up, perhaps. I'm not saying it looks very likely at the moment, but it is possible. So clearly, as Marx says, this is not something that we should be striving for or hoping for. The only democratic solution for us is the working class as the agency, the association of the free producers. It's also the idea that democracy is global capitalism, and Rob has touched on it, and there are lots of ideas, I think, where this is something that Marx and Engels would have wanted and argued for. Overcoming the division of town and country makes absolute sense. The 15-minute city, that concept, which is also I think is being put forward by some very unpleasant people, but from the right, which underlines the danger of a semi-fascistic solution coming as well. But this is also something that I think Marx and Engels would have considered, that we should live where we work where we live, that we don't have to drive for an hour to get to work or to the shops, etc., but that everything is within your local reach, etc., makes entire sense. Local empowerment from below, etc. So this is something I think they would have embraced, local democracy. And of course, they were also fans of what they called, the small egalitarian primitive communist societies that lived locally and organized locally in relative harmony with nature, etc. But Marx and Engels didn't argue for a return to that, and wouldn't have, because A, it's stupid, B, it's impossible. You can't go turn the clock back. Capitalism is global and cannot be superseded by socialism in one country, let alone one region or one socialist locality. Not even Jamie Driscoll can do that. Oh God, I had some arguments over that the last few days. You can't have socialism in one city or in one locality. For a start, you'll be crushed by international capitalism if you do it against, global capitalism. But also, of course, from a point of view of production, it makes entirely sense to produce some things locally, yes, but other things, of course, it makes sense to produce them in an organized global plan. It makes more sense to have whatever bananas grown in Africa rather than have huge greenhouses here and stuff. If you organize distribution, etc., in a sustainable way, in a democratic way, that makes a lot more sense. So global democratic planning is needed to create true abundance, where we have the time, where we have the facilities to live and live about, don't just exist in order to find our next meal, etc., and to avoid repetition that the locality next 20 miles down the road they have to produce the same things in the same way that we do. Whereas if you combine forces, it makes a lot more sense. I'm not talking huge USSR style massive plants, but some things it makes more sense to organize them globally. And that brings me then, last point is the sort of the organizational side of these groups, and particular Just Stop Oil. And because they are so big in the news, I do want to look at them a little bit. And I think I'm running out of time, but this is quite important. I think they are based on the idea of 3.5%, which I say is a simple one. I quoted here, it's very simple. It's to build a movement that's too big for the government and the fossil industry to ignore, and to do it one door at the time. So the leaders of both Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, etc., Roger Halamis and Erica Chenoweth, they believe that you only need to convince 3.5% of the population of something for it to become reality. Which that's how apparently that's gay marriage. That's how that went through, and they say they put a lot of scientific work into finding out how change comes about, and that's what you need, 3.5%, which then logically leads to PR stunts. All you need to do is get in the paper, make a lot of fuss, make a lot of noise, a lot of people hear you, and when 3.5% actively support you, that's your goal. So you piss off the workers who need to get to work. You piss off the mum who needs to get her child to school. You piss off the person who needs to get to their appointment in hospital. Doesn't matter, because you might have convinced one or two other people that your campaign is the right thing to do. It also means that you don't think about how to organize, really. For example, they're doing it, say, non-violent and peaceful. So we don't need to take on the armed wing of the state, especially because we only need 3.5% with us. They don't have a plan to overthrow capitalism. They don't have a plan to split the army, etc., etc. So we do it. We just sit there and do that thing and reject the idea that we need to do something about the state. Also leads to decentralization instead of democratic structure. And that has created quite a lot of difference and problems internally in XR and Just Stop Oil, where there is no leadership you can elect or get rid of. So there are people in charge for sure, but you just can't challenge them. So it's the old problem with the anarchist way of running things is somebody somewhere is making the decisions. You can be sure of that. You just don't know where they are and you can't get rid of them. So obviously for Marxists, an entirely different strategy is needed. It needs the majority, the active, conscious majority of the population, the 99%, however many are, or well, let's say at least 67% you need to have on board to really change things. And this is an entirely different strategy to what Just Stop Oil do. Doesn't mean we have to go and lecture them every time we see them, etc. But it is an entirely different approach. And I think we should always keep that in mind and stress that Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion have no plan, no strategy for winning over the majority of people to a democratic solution like socialism. They do not. One final look very quickly at degrowth communism, because that's become popular recently. Kohei Soito, his book has sold 500,000 already, Capital in the Anthropocene. And like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett, he wants to reclaim Marx and Engels' contribution to ecology. And he does a relatively good job with that, but his idea is actually pretty similar to what some of the green people say. You need to degrowth. And that, I think, has problems. He does not distinguish between what needs to degrow. So he doesn't make a distinction between poorer countries, for example, who still live in a level of subsistence which we would find quite shocking, which is clearly not designed to sustain a form of socialism. It's very poor. Again, he doesn't distinguish that. That needs the same degrowth globally as everybody else. So the idea is an interesting one. It's certainly caught on, but I think as Marxists we would point out that some things need to grow. Those parts of the economy that are organized around human well-being and ecological generation, for a start, they need to have investment. They need to be growing. And obviously then there are vast parts of the economy which could be degrown like that, the not just destructive production, but advertisement, those kind of things, PR, Facebook, there's millions of banks, there's millions of jobs which have really no productive value for humanity. And they could be done away with pretty quickly. And I'll leave it at that. Sorry, I've gone on much longer than I was planning. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Tina. Superb. Two excellent introductions. So I'm just going to abuse the privilege of the chair briefly to say a couple of little things while you're thinking of your questions out there in the audience. As I understand it, one of the things that always struck me is interesting was the similarities that exist between, on the one hand, Proudhon, who Marx argued with. In fact, they were friends until Marx tore his work to shreds in The Poverty of Philosophy. And then, so the similarities where Proudhon was arguing that what we have to do is in some way go back to simple artisan production. His was arguably not the voice of, a form of anarchism, which is the idea of a kind of go back to an earlier period of small-scale production. By contrast, for Marx, we do need abundance. I think that the argument is that we already have abundance. It's just that so much is wasted upon military expenditure, vast numbers of jobs which are completely unnecessary if you have a genuinely socialist society. So, for example, if we see the end of wage labor, the end of wage slavery effectively, you immediately don't need to be driving to work to commute, as the point which was of course made by Roll. You immediately don't need a whole infrastructure that's associated with that destructive form of consumption, the production, for example, of everyone having to have their own car, that kind of thing. And whole swathes of the economy, banking, insurance, finance. If you think about it, you could probably reduce the working week to about 10 hours of necessary labor fairly quickly in a socialist society. So the prerequisite for that, of course, is a kind of direct participative democracy. And but there is an appeal, isn't there, about the whole kind of area around degrowth. In my lifetime, tens of thousands of miles of hedgerows have been ripped out of the countryside and had a catastrophic effect upon wildlife and so on. And yet, for agriculture, which is often not particularly productive in a worldwide context, if we contrast that with, for example, palm oil production in some parts of the world, which has seen massively diverse ecosystems destroyed in favor of just one plant, for producing palm oil, and that's purely because of commodity production in a capitalist context. So how do we reconcile the need for abundance with the need for direct participative democracy and facing this distinction between town and country? Rob?
So I think, if we're thinking about this question of, the need for abundance, we need an abundance, we need to meet our current level of consumption. Again, I think, there exists within our society the technology to produce that abundance locally. As I stated in my talk, we have, there is an entirely green greenhouse, and has a negative carbon footprint, producing 90% of one country's tomatoes, and it's only 5,000 square miles. It's not big, square meters even. Sorry, so it's not massive. It's small enough to produce 90%. So we have the technological solutions to have abundance, even in a local setting. If we could replicate that for every crop, there's no need. There is no reason that our growth, the agricultural needs of society could be met. Now, commodity is a very different question. At what point do we draw the line at what somebody needs and what somebody wants? And I think that's a difficult question, and one that we have to consider. I think, given the interconnectedness that we are provided with technology, we have to keep up a degree of technological production. However, we need to be looking for other solutions, and particularly in the manufacturing the manufacturing area of these technological devices, because as we've already pointed to, there's a great deal of exploitation in the production of lithium batteries, in the production of smartphones. There's a great level of there's a whole international trade that's massive. So I think there does need to be a reassessment of where we're getting this technology from, and how we can source rare earth metals. I think there probably will be a technological breakthrough within our lifetimes in this regard. But again, we can't rely on it. And again, how quickly can it be rolled out? With a division, with the separation of town and country that we have at the moment, there is a tremendous amount of waste and tremendous amount of resources poured into transportation that doesn't necessarily need to happen. And I think the dissolution of that will have positive effects for society. Not only in a sense of the way we work and the way we relate. You're right when you say 10 hours of labor time per person is more than enough to produce everything we need. But again, how do we distribute that? And I think there's a lot of questions here that we need to research. We need to do a lot more work about to be able to really envisage what the society could look like.
Thank you, Rob. Conchita's already put her hand up. I'll come on to you in a moment, comrade, after Tina's reply. Comrades, please put your hands up. If you don't want to speak, then please put questions in the chat, and we'll come on to. So Tina first, and then Conchita, please.
Slightly disagree with what Rob just said, who said we can and should meet our current levels of consumption. I mean, we can meet them, but should we? I mean, that's obviously if we think about a totally different society, and that's what we're doing, isn't it? Not just with this series, but as Marxists, we do have a vision of living in a totally different way with each other and with nature. I think a lot will have to change, and a lot will change in a society that we envisage as what socialism would be like, what we're going towards, isn't it? I mean, we could think about technological advances by Elon Musk doing this or that, and who's that going to benefit? It's going to benefit him and his caste, his class of very, very rich people. If we consider a society that runs totally different, a sustainable society, etc., with where people change as well, where we change our relationships with each other. We don't all have to live in our own little houses right next to each other. You just combine that. You can have that in a more human way. So you don't have to have 100 washing machines for 100 people, you know, things like that. You don't have to have everybody cook their own meal, or everybody, you know, throw away their clothes when they don't fit anymore, you know, give them to somebody else. I mean, there's efforts being made with that, but as a rule, you know, that's how we should be doing stuff. As a rule, we own everything together, we share it, whoever needs, you know, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. So you know, we're thinking a totally different way of organizing, of living, and what humans need. But I do think that there are vast areas of the planet where humans need development, and where they are living in shit conditions, in really horrific conditions, where there even, you know, there's no irrigation, there's no proper sanitary, etc., etc., and people die in their 20s, 30s because they live in absolutely horrific conditions. This will get worse, I think, with the climate catastrophe. We'll have millions of people being displaced because sea levels going up, etc. So poverty across the globe will increase quite dramatically, I believe, you know, while also money goes up, etc. But there will be vast numbers of people who need to be housed, etc. And that requires some kind of quite dramatic solutions that go much beyond what capitalism, or what somebody like Elon Musk, or poor Elon Musk, you know, he's actually one of the better ones. I mean, he's producing children like there's no tomorrow, because he's actually been saying there is a problem with underpopulation. You know, he wants more people on the planet, so he's at least coming from that, and not you know, doesn't see people as the problem. But you know what I mean, that there might be technical innovations or whatever, but at the same time there will be huge poverty and refugees, etc., that need an entirely different way of thinking, and how to do the, you know, the abundance and how to combine that. And I think where real democratic planning has to be developed, we have to understand, or we have to start talking about what planning actually means. When we hear planning, we think of 5-year plan in the USSR, which was obviously not based on need. It wasn't based on what people wanted. It was based on showing off, and it was based on, you know, Hillel Tickton tells this funny story where they had to, you know, they were asked to build or produce 5 tons of what is it, 5 tons of nails or something, and they produced a 5-ton nail, you know, which nobody can use, etc. But they fulfilled the plan. Didn't serve anybody, you know, didn't help anybody live. Quite the opposite. It was just stupid. And so, you know, what we need is global planning on a huge scale. I just want to pick something up in the chat, because I've been criticized for being too rude and too mean to just stop oil, etc. I have that tendency. We have to convince them that they're wrong. You know, I mean, it's pretty obvious. We can admire their energy, and we can applaud them when they're doing something useful, but they're doing a lot of activities which actually divides the working class from them, the people they should be trying to win over. And they've had these discussions as well. It's not, we're making this up. They've had debates internally on these issues, and we know that, and XR has done it as well, you know, that some of them understand that they actually need to win over the majority, and not just the 3.5%, and that would lead to different strategies. And if we can influence them in that direction, and we've had very comradely discussions with some of them already, all the better. What we shouldn't just do is, if we know it's actually wrong and not going to change what's required, we don't have to applaud them if we think what they're doing is actually wrong. So you can do you can have a comradely, critical discussion with people, and most people are quite keen to listen and to debate, and some even change their views sometimes.
Thank you. We've got 2 people with their hands up now. So could I, if you wouldn't mind taking them both, if that's okay. So Conchita, please. Conchita? Oh, do you need to unmute yourself?
Oh, she's just coming in as a panelist.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. I wanted to since I was 16, I read E.F. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And that book has been with me all my life. And I wonder if you've heard about him. I thought Tina might have heard about him because he's German, although he lived in England, in Britain after the war. But I feel that you need to grow into this in a mixed economy. And his ideas of keeping things simple have encouraged me to get to know how to grow my own food and to learn how to look after earth, a bit of earth, to grow things, to realize how dirty patches of lands are, that we're so polluted from decades. So when we were clearing our allotment plot, there was stuff there that was from the 50s, pollution from the 50s in a little plot. So just getting to know in a mixed economy how to familiarize ourselves with those things, I think would help make us better political decisions as to what really is important, what to demand from the councils, and especially the facilities to grow your own locally. What do you think about that? Do you think it's a good idea to have a mixed sort of economy and also have something smaller?
Thank you, Conchita. Over to Mark.
Good evening. I'm sorry I didn't hear all the talk. I had the essentials of making the tea for us. So my apologies in a way. I did hear remarks about there being three agricultural revolutions taking place, which is an accurate, I would say described as accurate. For those who don't know, I've written for the Land Worker magazine of Unite for well over 20 years. Even before I was a writer, I was writing for the magazine. Lots and lots of stuff. There's very little interest amongst socialists and labour movement activists about what happens in rural communities. I'd like to stick up for one or two rural socialists, because it's very difficult to be a socialist in a rural community. The levels of harassment that they get, particularly in the fox hunting areas, is extensive. To come out and to be a socialist in some of those areas is a very, very brave decision. There's no question about that. The fourth revolution, in essence, is taking place at this current time, and it's very much a capitalist revolution. They know here that we need to grow, we need to have more trees. And so what they're doing is they're replacing food production, particularly across the north, with the growing of trees, and they are subsidizing major capitalist companies to do this. And it's a very, very lucrative swapping of public money into private hands. Over the last few years, myself and Charlie Clutterbuck have taken people on walks to areas where food used to be grown and shown people where food could still be grown at this particular period. I put in the chat Charlie's book from 2016 called Bittersweet Brexit, The Future of Food, Farming, Land and Labour, which was produced by Unite Education. I've got that together. I won't go into it now, but it was subsequently banned, and there was plans to actually throw away all the copies because the title caused apoplexy amongst the highest levels of the Labour Party in the period leading up to 2017 general, into the 2019 election in particular. The very title was a terrifying prospect for some of the top people in the trade union and in the Labour Party at that particular period of time. It's an excellent book. Charlie is a socialist, although it certainly doesn't propose socialist solutions. How could it? There's nobody listening, to be frank. What it did propose was that whether we were in Europe or out of Europe, the monies that was put towards the common agricultural policy, which was about 3 billion, should be swapped into job subsidies in rural communities. And we estimated that 300,000 jobs per year could have been created at a £10,000 a year subsidy in those areas. But it includes some fascinating stuff in the book in general, loads and loads of stuff. Charlie became a socialist back in the 1950s, working class school in Birmingham. And what was his shock and surprise, which is a surprise because I've heard people saying it sort of here, is that there was already by then sufficient food to feed the masses. It's estimated that we could have enough food to produce enough food for 14 billion people to live on the planet that we currently have. We have a situation across the world where 1/3 of food is thrown away. And that's higher than that's actually higher in the UK. Most people throw about excessive amounts of food. And it's estimated internationally that about 1/8 of the world is obese. Now, there are some medical reasons perhaps for that, but there's one hell of a lot of food which currently gets thrown away. On a separate level, I do think that socialists should support, whilst I do agree with Tina, food should come from wherever it's grown. It has to, however, be said that the major food production places at this current time where things are grown are not grown in the countries where they were originally developed or first even thought of. They've all moved right across the world, and they will continue to do so, as was sort of alluded to. But I do think food should be grown locally. I think the examples of Incredible Edible in Todmorden, just up the road here, where people can go up and pick up foodstuffs which have been grown, you know, vegetables and all those things for free, are very good examples, and I think they should be seized upon. And I also do think, I mean, I had some chats with some kids around here where we live in Halifax, and we live, you know, a really beautiful area in Halifax. To be fair, it's just a working class estate, but it goes out onto the Pennines. And I was talking to kids about where food came from, and all of them think it comes from tins. They have no concept whatsoever of where food actually comes from. So I do think that's a pretty important thing in breaking down the idea that food is magically created. And I'm very much in favor of going forward that people do have the opportunity to grow their own food in gardens and in small locations. So yeah, that's all. And my favorite book, by the way, if you're talking about the agriculture and the environment, my favorite book, possibly of all time outside of some sort of proper socialist terms, is Who Owns Britain, which was done by Kevin Cahill, who was the election agent for Paddy Pantsdown, as it happens. So he's a liberal, but that basically just tells people who actually owns the land. And there's very little interest amongst the trade union and labour movement, and there has historically been very little interest on what I feel are major political subjects. Cheers for your time.
Thank you, Mark. Do you want to answer those questions first, or do you want to take it more? Yep.
I'll answer some of them. I think I'll come to Kachita's point first. And I think, yes, I think the kind of small scale producing is kind of part of the vision that Marx and Engels had in mind for the kind of working class. And that is that the return to a sort of balance with nature, that people are connected with nature again. That people can, you know, produce their own food and produce the kind of means of their own subsistence in a way that makes rational sense. And I think that the kind of small economy is definitely kind of a way to envisage that in a communist society. And the difference is being, of course, that people have a lot more room to do that. We won't be relegated to small gardens or allotments. The kind of access that kind of working people could have to the land is much greater. in a kind of communist society, because there's an abolition of private property. I mean, if you look at it in this country at how much property is given over to, given over to kind of deer walks or to sheep production, which is entirely unproductive for food and wool purposes. It's not, it's far from ideal for providing for the people of this nation. So I think, I think small scale economy and small scale agriculture is definitely an important aspect to think about. And I think you're right that people have been de-skilled in that capacity, that we know, the population at large don't have that awareness of how to grow or how to look after plants, because we've been alienated from nature. We've lost that connection that I think is very important to bring back. So I'd agree with you completely on that. On to Mark Metcalf. I think, when I was merely quoting from Bellamy Foster, if there is indeed a fourth agricultural revolution, I'm not in agricultural circles, and I was kind of aware of that when I was writing about it. But I think replacing food production with production of trees, I think, for climate purposes, we do need more trees, but, not at the expense of local agricultural production. Again, in a communist society, it's entirely possible that you could have the coexistence of both. You could have trees and kind of crop production in a local area that provides for itself. I've seen in the comments as well a lot of kind of talk about the meat industry. I know the meat industry is terrible for kind of it's just an incredibly wasteful way to produce things. I think if Marx could see the meat industry of today, he would say that is it's a demonstrable way to kind of treat nature. It's that kind of idea of man dominating nature rather than allowing it to exist in a natural capacity. That is to say, I'm not a vegan, but I do think that meat consumption could be more ethical and more localized again. So it's about that lack of alienation. I think in terms of job subsidies in the rural environment, and again, I would consider that to be a small scale solution to a massive problem. It might solve things immediately now for rural populations, but we're looking at the biggest picture. What is communist society going to be? What do we want our relationship with nature to be going forward? Not what it is now, and maybe small amenable changes we can make to capitalism to make it fit. Socialism's the answer, communism's the answer to these problems. It's not to just simply modify the jobs market a little bit. I think we need to be punching a bit higher in terms of our aspirations for change. But I agree with you, a third of food being thrown away is a horrendous kind of statistic. And you're right when you talk about levels of food consumption in imbalance. Again, a communist society seeks to do away with that distinction. It seeks to do away with the distinction between the rural and the city. That the cities dissolve and become more rural themselves, and that the countryside becomes more city-like in itself. So it's that kind of destruction of that false kind of distinction that we have in capitalism, and reducing those reliance on imports and promoting local kind of agriculture, I think is very much a big part of what Marx and Engels were envisaging. Thanks.
Tina.
Yeah, again, slight disagreement with Rob, just a small one. I mean, we're not reformists, as Marx says clearly, but we do fight for reforms as well, don't we, in the here and now. I mean, we don't say, oh, until capitalism is finished, there's nothing we can do. So fuck it all, we're not going to make any changes to how people are living, and we want their living conditions to improve, don't we? And we fight for those reforms. We just don't pretend that they are the answer. I mean, that's what's my point of being critical of groups like Just Oil. We can applaud them for this and that, but we shouldn't pretend that they provide the answer, because they don't. So by fighting for reforms, if we're not reformists, I think it's perfectly fine to fight for reforms, in the sense if they're building up the power of the working class, the confidence of the working class. This is what it's all about, isn't it? We should always fight for democracy, etc., not because it's a nice idea, but because we need it. We need it to organize. We need to be, we have to have free speech. We need to be able to organize democratically, etc., to build our forces. That's why we're calling for reforms, to build up the working class in its confidence and what it can fight for. So in terms of a mixed economy, I mean, which usually means something else, but if it's locally produced food or national produced food, Marx was quite clear on not doing any blueprints for what socialism would be like. But clearly, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to do both, doesn't it? It makes a lot of sense to have some things produced where it's the cheapest or the quickest or takes least effort. You don't need to bend natural laws to grow things in a particular country because it's ripe there. You know, it can grow very well there, whereas it can't grow very well here. So it makes sense to do it there and then to bring it to other people if they so wish. But of course, I mean, in terms of, and as Rob pointed out, you know, this growing your own food is a human thing as well, isn't it? It makes you more human. It makes you a fully rounded person if you don't just open the tin, but you can see where it grows. And it actually does something to you, even just watching flowers grow outside in your garden or a plant, isn't it? It's a very human experience and it's good for kids, etc. And we'll have more time for it. You know, who's got time now to grow their own food, etc. You have to, you know, quit your job to do that because it is quite inefficient if you want to do it all. But if you do bits and bobs, you know, as a nice experience, then go for it if that's your thing. Is it a question of distribution? Of somebody in the chat, and Mark tended to that. Of course, it shows the irrationality of capitalism. That, you know, rather, and it's not a mistake, isn't it? It's not done. All it needs is somebody. I'm going to bring up Elon Musk again. You know, all we need is him to say, stop throwing that food away and give it to the poor. There's a reason why they throw it away. It keeps up prices, etc. You know, it makes no sense from a capitalist point of view to just give the food to poor people who don't have food, who are starving. You know, it's bad for their profits. That's why they're not doing it. So there's a logic there, you know. So just distributing isn't going to solve it. It's a question of who's producing for who and stuff. And that's why we're saying, as Marxists, it's not about distribution, it's about production. The working class needs to be in charge of production, as well as the basis of society, as well as everything else in society. So, you know, it's not just appealing to the government to do something a bit more cleverer in terms of distributing. It's about taking it out of their hand and democratically deciding, everybody everywhere, how things are produced, for what purpose, what do we need, some real democratic planning to decide globally what actually does need producing and what doesn't. And, you know, as I said before, I think we could scale down quite a lot while bringing up some countries that need a higher level of production and etc. This doesn't go for the West, where it actually needs to go down a bit. Do we all need to fly on holidays? You know, which is often like to escape your ratty life, isn't it? You escape, you work your ass off here, and all you have to look forward to is going away once a year or twice a year if you're lucky. Again, that something like that will change, I would have hoped, in the process to socialism, communism, that you're actually quite happy with your lot, and you might explore things or not, but you know, there's this need to get away on a plane, etc., as quickly as possible is a different, you know, we can have a different vision for a much different future like that.
Oh, thank you. Is it, to take a few questions now, is it Graham or Caroline Keane? Is that Graham?
It's Graham, yeah.
So Graham.
Okay.
Yeah, Caroline.
Right. I like to.
Sorry, I have to go. I can't wait. I've got to go. Sorry about that.
What about Felicity going first?
What about
No, it's
Felicity
okay.
going
I
first? I don't mind.
It's somebody's birthday, so it's just all I wanted to say was I'm very disappointed to hear criticism of Just Stop Oil, who and if you don't know their rationale, then maybe you should look it up. I know you said you thought you knew their theory, but the rationale is that you want as many people to be aware. You shouldn't criticize people who are doing things, who are doing something positive. And globalization certainly isn't the answer. I agree, cars we should get rid of. There are so many, we've got to change our whole way of life. And if we change our whole way of life and our whole way of thinking, then things will change because I have to change. So yeah, so I really do find it difficult when you're not doing anything, Tina, and yet you're critical of people who are. Sorry, but I have to go now. Sorry, I wish I could wait.
I've heard a number of things levelled at Tina over the years, but the idea that she doesn't do anything is probably one of the more extraordinary accusations. I've never known anybody work quite so hard.
Yeah, but we can all go
in
to
the meantime,
meetings. We can all go to meetings. I go to
I-
meetings and
with
speak at
respect-
meetings.
No, I understand. With respect, comrade, I think she does a bit more than that. But your point is absolutely taken, and will certainly form the basis of a discussion. And I'm glad you made it. But can I ask Graham, please?
Yeah. I'd like to, I worked for years as a musician, and so I tend to look at things in terms of political orchestration, if you like. And I think when you look at society, you can think of it in terms of an orchestra with everyone having different abilities, playing different instruments, and how they come together. And of course, there are large orchestras, there are small orchestras, but there are differences. And society, we have to realize that society is like that. It's not the case of we go, equality means we're all identical. We are all different coming together and giving our system some kind of musicality. And that's how I'm looking at it. It's not just a case of, oh, well, we all have to be identikits. No, we don't. We have to be able to work differently and appreciate our differences. That's really my point.
Thank you very much. And Simon, please.
Thanks. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the great introductions, Tina and Rob. Things a bit blurry. I just had a couple of points kind of raising from the discussion, which I thought was quite interesting. I mean, on Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion and groups like that, I mean, obviously, they're incredibly brave people. I mean, they're getting assaulted in the street by, you know, enraged car users, and loads of them have gone to prison and, you know, or like at the very least been arrested. So I don't think anyone's kind of criticizing the bravery of the people involved. I think it's whether the tactics are going to be able to build the kind of movement that we need to win. I think that's more Tina's point. I mean, I think Just Stop Oil starts from the perspective that people aren't aware of the climate crisis. And so they need to do disruptive tactics that get in the newspapers to make people aware of the climate crisis. That's why they're throwing orange paint everywhere and, you know, disrupting like Wimbledon and things like that. I'm not sure that it's that people aren't aware of the extent of the climate crisis. I mean, it's in the news almost every day. It's in newspapers. And lots of people are just flat out deniers, but I think lots of people are aware of the scale of the climate crisis. I think the problem is they don't feel empowered to do anything. I mean, I'm sure we all do the same thing. We come to meetings like this, or we watch a documentary about environmental crisis, or you know, and then you just think, well, you know, like, because it's not just a question of, say, you know, in the 80s, there was like CFC emissions that created the hole in the ozone layer. And then everyone said that was bad. And the capitalist class managed to introduce a series of, you know, reforms, you know, like regulations, which kind of reduce the amount of CFCs. And the hole in the ozone layer is now closing up, which is my understanding. That's good, but that's only one thing. When you're talking about global warming, you're talking about the entire productive basis of capitalism on a global scale. You know, you're talking about fossil capitalism, you're talking about, you know, the last 200 years of the way things have developed and been organized. And so I think people feel quite disempowered around that. And I don't think seeing people walking slowly in the road or disrupting sporting events, and again, I'm not criticizing the bravery of those people for doing that. I don't think it provides a strategy for how we can tackle that fundamental problem, which is a problem of capitalism. And so, like, I mean, I agree with what Tina was saying as well about, you know, like, we need to build a movement within the working class and popular forces. I would say we could call that an eco-socialist movement or just a socialist movement or whatever, but it has to be something that challenges within the broad social formations that we have. Like, for instance, I think, you know, Keir Starmer's obsession with growth at the moment, you know, is just ridiculous. Like, And there's so much good stuff being written about how just focusing on growth is not going to solve the problem. In fact, it's adding to the problem, and he's just ignoring that. And there's also debates within the unions. I mean, Unite and the GMB do not have good positions around some of the industries we're talking about, like oil or like airplanes and things. So like there's lots of arguments going on within the movement, and I don't think Just Stop Oil is even really touching any of that stuff. So I guess it's like, what are socialists doing around those kind of things? I just want to say like a super quick thing as well, just on like, because I know there's lots of discussion in the chat about food. I think on Twitter yesterday, I don't know if people saw it, there was a big row about bananas. There was someone in the US, like a US socialist, who said, let's face facts, under socialism, we just won't have bananas in the United States. We're going to cut back massively on banana production. We're going to stop transporting bananas around the world. Americans just have to face facts. You can't eat, however many tons of bananas they eat every year. And of course, that led to a huge row and a big argument about bananas and who was going to get bananas or not. And lots of right-wing people were coming in and saying, if socialism means I can't have a banana, I don't want socialism. I think we should just maybe steer away from banana discourse a little bit. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about some of the ways that food production might shift and change under socialism, but I think we need to focus on quite, big strategic questions and think about how we can articulate that, because, we've got to build a mass movement that inspires millions, if not billions of people. And I think if we always end up sort of saying, well, socialism will be, you've got to grow bananas, like you've got to grow like potatoes in your back garden, and you don't get to eat a banana, and you don't get to do this, you don't get to do that. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to mobilize people, I guess. Like, that's my thinking. I'm not saying that under a democratic social society we won't make those decisions. Maybe we will eat fewer bananas under a social society, but that would be a decision that we have made collectively as a society, rather than kind of speculation going on now, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Simon. Diana.
Well, I've got distracted by bananas now, and I could do.
Easily done.
Without bananas, I can't manage without coffee or chocolate. Anyway, that's being a bit frivolous, I suppose. I can't remember everything he said, but I agree to back a lot of what Marx said about food. Food production actually is quite produces quite a lot of greenhouse gases, but the worst thing about it, I suppose part of it, the main thing is it's being used as profit making thing, which is terrible. It's dreadful for people's health. It's dreadful for the environment, for land, and not everybody gets enough to eat. But what nobody's mentioned is the way the government is now pushing genetically modified crops, and I should have posted some stuff in the chat, and I did about that. I didn't. That, in fact, what the government is doing, and it fits in with what others have said about growing in corporations getting paid to grow trees where food was produced and stuff like that. What the government is doing is moving. Now we're out of the EU, which was bad enough, but moving food production into more of a even more of a profit-driven thing, pushing out smaller farmers and interdependent producers, and pushing GM crops, which are environmentally disastrous, bad for health. They're not safe to eat. I can provide information about that. And what the whole point of them is to make profits for the corporations that push them, and it's all part of patenting seeds so that you don't small farmers, doesn't happen so much in Britain. I think they've been pushed out more, but it's partly a global thing. Don't develop and keep their own seeds and keep the seeds that have been of food crops that have been developed over generations by small producers and indigenous producers. I think that's probably been pushed out more here than it has in poorer countries in the sort of global south. So there's definitely a case for everybody trying to grow as much stuff as they can themselves. I try and grow a bit, but it does take a lot of work, and I can't do it. And not everybody has the space. But there's also a movement of growing stuff in cities, and that's what Cuba is doing. There's a lot of organically grown food being produced in Cuba, because Cuba has been subjected to the blockade by the US ever since its revolution. So they've always had a problem with trying to feed everybody, and what they're doing is they're growing stuff in cities, and I think the more agricultural land, they're changing the way they're doing it. So I think somebody mentioned, I can't remember whether it was somebody in the chat or one of the speakers mentioned about the sugar production damaging the Cuban land. So I think there's moves in Cuba to try and repair that damage. I'm not sure what else I was going to say. I think I covered it. There is a lot. There's some problems. I think farmers in Wales are having problems. They can't buy or rent land for farming because it's been taken over by corporations with carbon offsetting and planting unsuitable trees. And I think something like that's been happening in Dartmoor as well. I think that the number of sheep grazing, and I think it's sheep grazing in Dartmoor, it might be ponies and stuff as well. Livestock generally anyway. They're being pushed off the land, whereas I've seen or heard comments about how those animals actually help maintain the landscape and the ecology there. I've probably said enough now.
No, well, excellent points. I mean, just as a insignificant point of interest, Dartmoor ponies are being used locally here to help maintain land. They play a very important part in the ecosystem. But of course, very important points around sheep production. We see it throughout Scotland, for example, areas turned over to grouse moor, a whole range of other things, which are not related to food production, but are related to social and class relations. I'll just make a couple of little points and then ask our speakers to sum up, please. And as some of you will know, I'm a nurse by trade, and so therefore have an interest in disease. And of course, disease is intimately bound up not only with food production and poverty of food production and so on, but also has played a part in social transition. For example, arguably the demise of the Roman Empire was speeded up by malaria becoming a feature in the Italian peninsula. We know that the Black Death of the 14th century hastened the demise of feudalism, and the Black Death itself was a direct consequence of an international trade in commodities, which led to the transmission of Rattus rattus, the black plague-carrying rat, as opposed to the more normal Rattus novegicus. disease has been an important part. And of course, that other great pandemic, the one that's sort of receding in people's memories, that of AIDS, has absolutely decimated the African continent and a lot more countries besides, and is still a huge, having a huge effect on world populations. So, on that note, comrades, who would like to go first to sum up? Tina? Yep. Rob?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on a few points made. I think Simon made some excellent points, and I think, again, Tina's criticised me a number of times for kind of saying, oh, well, we're not going to be able to have everything the same. And it's like, well, again, the technological advances that have been made allow us to produce bananas wherever we are. We can grow bananas in any country, anywhere, anytime. We have that capacity now. We don't have, it's not like, and it is accessible. It is something we can achieve. And it's also this notion of what science is under socialism, under communism. Science is not something that is exclusively used for the pursuit of commodity growth. Science under socialism could be an entirely different thing. We can research, how can we get a strain of banana that grows in the UK? Well, what is the future capacity of that? What can we put the scientific minds that are going to be? And this relates to what Graham was saying as well. Like, communism provides an avenue for everybody to pursue their kind of what they want to pursue. Funding for things that are going to generally help humanity isn't going to be an issue, because it's going to be the kind of purpose of the scientific community. It's that continual advancement of human society. Marx embraced the fertilization teachings of Liebig. We would be remiss if we ignored our own technological developments for the general improvement of humanity. And the fact that we do have this globalized diet, this varied kind of levels of consumption. I agree that consumption should come down, but it's those non-essential commodities that we need to think about. Do we really need to be always buying a new car? Do we always need to be continually upgrading and updating our technology? There already exists the capacity to make the technology we have last a lot longer, but we ignore it in exchange for the fast sale commodity. Mobile phones are produced with a shelf life that they don't necessarily need, because they want to continue producing and selling mobile phones because it's a successful business. And it's reality is, we need to come away from that method of production, of wasteful production, and be reusing all the constituent elements of our society again and again and again. And it's not about what we can't have, because I think I agree with Simon when I say too often it's depicted as, oh, under communism, you won't have this, you'll have to work in an agricultural job. And it's like, no, the reality is there are millions of people who would rather work in an agricultural job than work in an industrial job. But then, because of the conditions of their birth, because of the conditions of where they are, because of the unavailability of these jobs, they have to work in a call center, phoning people up and trying to make sales on a phone. When reality is, they want to be out in the farm, out in a field, growing something beautiful. Yeah, I think again, it's this fundamental move away from the capitalist economy. We need to completely break down that mode of production and rethink the way that we can communicate and work together to create a society that can provide for all of our needs and some of our wants. Thanks. That's me.
Thank you, Tina.
Don't disagree with anything there. It sounds like the opposite of a banana republic there, isn't it? That followers of the degrowth, communism, socialism develop, which sounds a lot like the USSR actually, and sort of scarcity and a horror vision of who decides, who that we can have bananas or not. It's just obviously an example, but it is a deeply uninspiring vision of what socialism could be like. You can't have this, you can't have that. Oh yeah, no, there's somebody in the background probably making all of these decisions, or we all have to cut back and we all have to just suffer a bit for the greater good. No, that's actually what we're trying to do with these series. I don't do much. Well, anyway, it's debatable. I don't do much useful. I don't go out and sit on the road or whatever. But what we're trying to do with this series is educate ourselves on a positive vision for what socialism actually is, inspire people to understand that this is not the same as the USSR was. It's not scarcity, it's not slavery, it's not keeping your mouth shut. It's the opposite. It's, you know, human liberation. It's us deciding what we want to produce, how we want to produce it, and living a free and full life, and to inspire people. And that's actually what we need to focus on, a positive vision for socialism. And this degrowth stuff sounds just like a really drag. It's not gonna, that's the main thing why it's not gonna take off. You know, who's gonna fight for that? Who's gonna fight for, you know, scarcity? No, thank you. And it's not necessary. I mean, we have, you know, the facilities to produce abundance, and it's already being done. It's just in the wrong hands. We need to take it into our hands, develop it much further in a way that obviously doesn't enslave the planet or the people, but in a democratic way. And it's important to understand that Marx and Engels, you know, were big fans of technology, but not for technology's sake, for liberating humanity's sake, for our use, you know, for freeing us so that we don't have to slave away 8 hours in a stupid job, but that we can, you know, maybe reduce working hours bit by bit. I mean, we do fight for reforms in the here and now, and in empowering the working class, you know, so we fight for low, you know, my dad used to work 30 hours a week in the 80s, you know, they fought for that, and they lost it again. But we can achieve things like that. You know, we can achieve a better life, work balance, to empower us to fight for other things as well. So we need a positive vision and not going back. And Marx and Engels didn't have that idea that we have to go back. They were big fans of, as I mentioned, these primitive communist societies, your urkommunistische, old, you know, in the olden days, before class society. But they would have never dreamt of saying we have to go back to that. We have to rewind, and we have to say, oh, we can't have this or we can't have that. No, going forward, clearly, you're you know, returning on a higher level. But you learn from these societies that humans are not selfish, you know, that we can live together in collective ways, in egalitarian ways. That's how we have to take from these societies, not going back and abandoning technology and etc. In terms of, you know, you shouldn't criticize people. I mean, read Marx, you know, just as a, you know, we are Marxists, read Marx. I mean, you have to wade through, and it's a bit dire in parts, isn't it? He's criticizing A, B, and people that, you know, you'll never hear of again. And, you know, there's cartoons on that as well. Engels saying to him, why on earth are you going on about this guy and that guy? In 100 years, nobody will remember them, you know. But it's obviously they're doing it to make important points, to say, you know, these are people who are calling themselves socialists. These are people who are calling themselves progressive. They go to the working class, or they go to the people and say, we have answers, follow us. And Marx and Engels, Lenin and as well, took it upon themselves to say, but your answers are wrong. Your answers will lead into dead ends. And this is the danger. You're leading people. Proudhon, Bakunin, you know, they had loads, and they spent so much time criticizing these people they were in the First International with them. You know, they were comrades. And yet Marx and Engels spent an awful lot of paper and time, you know, criticizing them because they had the wrong tactics, leading into a totally different political direction. And they knew that was the wrong direction. That's what we're trying to do in a small way. You know, you have to learn from mistakes, and our movement has made so many mistakes. We're being criticized for criticizing Corbyn, for example, as well. It's the same thing. We're not doing it to rub it in and to, you know, go, I told you. No, the point is, of course, if we ever get into a similar situations, we cannot afford to make the same mistakes again. We have to learn and understand what went wrong, what we did wrong, what our movement's done wrong, in order to do it better the next time. That's the only reason why we need to criticize it. Actually, it's our duty to criticize people we know are wrong. Dude, you can do it like an asshole, or you can do it in a nice way. I try to do it a nice way, but you know, it doesn't probably always work. But that's I think that's the point about being critical of other people in the movement. That's all. I'm all tired now. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you very much, comrades. That brings the current series of Why Marx to a pause, nothing more than a pause. By the end of August, we start again with a special series looking at building the party. Just in case people think that all we do is attend meetings, we're intensely concerned with building an active intervention into class politics. And class politics, what you will be seeing over the next few months is lots of attempts to launch another Labour Party, as if the first one was an outstanding success. So we'll be looking at the whole question of building a party, what that takes. So join us, comrades, again for I think it's the last Thursday in August for the beginning of our brand new series, and we'll take it from there. Thank you and good night, comrades. Thank you for an excellent discussion. Good night.
Thank you. That was good fun.
Thank you.